Hi there, Joel from Jonesy's Auto Club, and today we are working on our favorite 1993 Toyota Land Cruiser, specifically a solid axle. And I've heard through the grapevine that everybody really wants a how-to video on how to rebuild their steering knuckle and the Burfield joint. And then on top of that, we're also going to cover the brakes. To tackle the knuckle rebuild, I'm going to first go over some of the basic tools that you're going to need. If you work on Toyotas frequently, then you know that Toyota bolts come in a very standard size. You have a 10 millimeter, 12 millimeter, 14 millimeter, 17 millimeter, and 19 millimeter. Those are pretty much the sockets that you're going to need to do this. I use wobblies with impact guns. All this stuff you can do by hand. I want to get things done and I want to get them done fast, so I use power tools. In addition, you're going to need some miscellaneous punches, some side cutters, a couple of screwdrivers, specialty tools. You're going to need an axle nut socket. You can buy these pretty much any auto parts store has those, or you might even be able to rent them. You'll need some snap ring pliers, regular ratchets, some regular channel locks, hammer, as well as a bearing race driver. Okay. In addition, I'm going to show you a little specialty trick on how to disassemble the Burfield joint so that you can actually pack that full of grease. So if you follow me over to the workbench, I'll go through some of the components that you're going to want to get before you decide to tackle this project. Over here at the workbench, starting with the brake rotor. If you're going to do your brakes and or your steering knuckle rebuild, you definitely want to replace your brakes. These came from 360 Performance rotors. They are drilled, slotted. The price is amazing for what you're getting. They are completely and totally machined CNC in the United States and plated in the United States. Okay, on to steering knuckle. We called up NITRO Gear and Axle, and they sent us over their steering knuckle rebuild kit. I've already done half of the knuckle rebuild on this Land Cruiser, so I'm only going to show you one side. That verifies and guarantees that I have all the right tools out to show you guys a good video and not stumble around. Okay, in their kit, they give you the upper and lower trunnion bearings. This is for the top and the bottom of the knuckle. They give you the inner axle seal, and this one is the one that is prone to leaking and filling up your knuckle full of gear oil, which is a bad thing. Also give you a new wheel bearing seal, as well as a locking ring. On top of that, they give you all of the miscellaneous gaskets and wipers and felts that you're going to need to completely rebuild your knuckle. In addition, they give you multiple thicknesses of some trunnion shims. All this stuff will be covered in the video. Finally, the last thing that you guys are going to need in terms of kind of hard parts here is you're going to need a wheel bearing packer. I just use a regular standard grease. You're going to need some penetrating lubricant, a couple of cotter pins, minimum amount of gasket material. I like the gray RTV gasket. I avoid blue because I think it looks stupid, so gray or black. Gray is technically for imports. We're working on a Toyota, so I like to use gray. Finally, there is some kind of confusion as to what you install into your steering knuckle, and you need to get some specific CV axle moly based grease. It is grease, it is not an oil, it is not a 10W40 motor oil, it is not a 80-90 gear oil, it is a moly based grease that you need to pack into your housing. I've found that 3 4-ounce tubes is enough. One tube will go into the actual Burfield joint. The other 2 tubes will get injected into the cavity. Okay, that pretty much sums up the basic material list. So now we're going to go back over to the vehicle and pull the tire off and start disassembling. I'm about ready to tear into the Land Cruiser, and the last thing I want to cover is some safety and some cleanliness stuff. You're going to want to use some safety glasses You're going to be pounding on stuff. There's going to be a bunch of dirt, a bunch of debris, some mud. Probably going to want some heavy-duty gloves, some regular plastic gloves because you're going to be dealing with grease. Some way to clean your parts. I've got a recirculating parts washer. It would not be a bad idea to get this stuff taken apart, take it down to a machine shop and have it hot tank because there's a lot of grease, there's a lot of grime. I'm going to leave that up to you. Anyway, some brake cleaner, and then finally you're going to need a whole bunch of rags. Luckily I have a rag service, so I can go through these things like crazy, but if you're doing this in your driveway, you're going to want to source a whole bunch of rags. Okay. First step, get the tire off. I'm going to use an impact gun with a 13/16 socket. Okay, so I got the tire off, and what you're going to want to do, we're on the driver's side, you're going to want to turn the wheel and the rotor all the way to the passenger side. That just makes it a little bit easier to get to the two bolts that hold the brake caliper on. So I'm going to use a screwdriver and dig out a lot of this crap. This thing has definitely been four-wheeled, and we have leaves and dirt and debris packed in there from mud. So I'm going to start digging that stuff out, and then we're going to get the brake caliper off. So I'm just taking a screwdriver and digging all this mud out around the top here of this knuckle, trying to uncover all of the bolts that I need to have access to. There is a speed sensor right in the top here. You need to be careful that you don't damage the wire when you're digging around, but you need to uncover the two bolts that hold the caliper on. So once I kind of get a lot of this dirt and leaves and debris out of my way, and you'll be able to see there's a little clip that holds the pins in. It's a kind of a safety pin clip that holds the two pins that then hold the brake shoes into the caliper. So I used to use a screwdriver to pop those pins out, and you want to make note how this brake tensioner anti-rattle spring goes in. On my cart here, I keep my tools on the top shelf and my parts on the bottom shelf. So tools go on the top, extra parts go on the bottom shelf. It's a nice way to just keep everything separate. Inevitably I'm going to be fumbling around trying to find tools no matter what, but that does help to kind of minimize. Okay, now to compress the actual brake caliper pistons, I start out with a pair of channel locks, and you just want to do this as slowly as you can, and essentially you're just squeezing the pads and squeezing the pistons back. Now once you get one side done, I take a screwdriver, cram a screwdriver in there so that when you compress this set of pistons, it doesn't then just cause this set you just compressed to come back out. So if this shouldn't take a huge amount of force. I mean, you can tell I'm using pretty small channel locks. If this takes a whole lot of force, then you have some problems with your calipers. So squeeze those back, and I'm just going to do the final squeeze with a set of screwdrivers. If you're going to reuse your rotors, you want to be gentle with your rotors, not press on them too much. Okay, now once you've gotten those pistons scooted back, you can then go ahead and pull your pads out. So now I've pushed the pistons back. The caliper is ready to be removed, and it is held on there, like I said previously, with a couple of 17mm bolts. Okay, now you never want to let your caliper just dangle. And so what I do is I get a couple of tie wraps and I hang it from the spring, like so. Next step is to pop the tie rod off. And to do that, you're going to have to go digging for the cotter pin. And this thing, since it has been off-road, it is completely caked with mud and debris. Okay, I got the cotter pin out now. I'm going to use a 19mm socket to remove the castle nut. Now I'm going to take the castle nut off, and then I'm going to thread it back on a little bit so that I can pop this joint loose. Now, what's going to happen here is I'm going to actually have a friend take the pry bar, jam it right in there on top of the shock mount, like so, and push up on that bar while I beat on the steering arm to pop that loose. There, it popped loose. So we got that off of there, and now we can feel how the knuckle moves, and it feels pretty good. You want to kind of remember what that tension feels like so that when you go to set up your new tension on your new trunnion bearings, then you can duplicate that. Okay, now it's time to remove these. They're 12mm nuts. And what you want to do is you want to get them loose and then start the nut back on. And as you can see right here, we actually are missing one. Not uncommon for these to get over tight. There is a little tapered spacer inside there that you have to break loose. And it's going to seem crude, but this is how you do it. You take a hammer and you hit right on top of the axle flange, and it pops that. Hopefully you can see that it pops that little taper loose. You can see the tapered spacers. Okay, now you need to expose the end of the axle, because there's a little there's a snap ring underneath here. So that pulls that guy off. Then you can take your snap ring pliers and remove the snap ring. And I'm kind of stacking all this stuff up on my cart in the general order that it gets removed. Now, there's supposed to be, which is included in the kit, there's supposed to be a gasket here. A lot of times when people service their own stuff, they just use silicone. But there is an old gasket that we're going to go ahead and pull off. And now, what you'll see is we have our lock nut. Okay? What you need to find is the lock nut retaining washer, and it will have a couple of ears that are bent over. Hopefully you can zoom way in and see that little tab right there. And I'm just going to take a hammer and a screwdriver and bend that out of the way. Now comes your big axle nut socket. should loosen up pretty easily. This outer one basically just locks everything into place so that the inner one doesn't back off or tighten and cause your bearings, your wheel bearings, to preload. Now I'm pulling this off and you'll notice that this tab right here is bent in. That tab that's bent in locks in the inner axle nut. That should bang on it a little bit to get it to pop free. There it goes. And here is bearing washer for your front wheel bearings. Okay, and there is also your wheel bearing seal. To get the wheel bearing seal out, most of the time you can just use a pry bar that goes right underneath the seal and pop it out like that. And then that allows you to get your inner front wheel bearing out. Okay, now we're going to continue to dissect this rotor right up here on the bench. The hub and the rotor are two separate pieces, and the hub actually bolts to the rotor. So take a 17mm socket and slowly start to work it around, and it'll eventually come off. If you live in the rust belt, these things can be rusted on here really, really tight. So you can kind of see just that couple little bangs has already gotten me some separation. Okay, now grab a drain pan, set it kind of down underneath the spindle here, and take one of your rags and try to get as much grease off of this thing as you possibly can. And what we're digging for right now is we are digging for all of these bolts that hold this dust shield on. And these bolts also sandwich the spindle and a bunch of other components. So take a 14mm socket, and I always like to pull one of the lower ones out first. And if you pull these out and fluid starts to leak out of those holes, you know your inner axle seal is leaking. Want me to say that again?
No, you're fine.
Okay, you know your inner axle seal is leaking. On the passenger side, we had gear oil that was just pouring out. This side, we do not. So we'll continue to remove all these bolts. Okay, last bolt. Here's a seal, a little dust seal. It's got a big chunk missing out of it. And you can see this little indentation right here designates the bottom. So the little hole right there goes up. You can see it right there. I'll show you this stuff on the new parts, and then that little seal goes on the bottom. So throw that out of the way, and then there's a gasket right here. Again, the little indentation goes down, and your dust shield. Now, I'm going to tap off the spindle, like so. You remove the speed sensor. This is a simple 12mm bolt right on top here. And it's just sealed in there with a little O-ring. Okay, so I take it and kind of wrap it up into that spring to get it out of the way. And then you can pull your axle all the way out. Let's set that aside. Okay, at this point, now it's time for the actual knuckle housing, this piece right here, to get removed. Before you start removing this, you need to take the wipers and the felts off of the backside. Those are held on with 6 10mm bolts. So I'm going to blast those off with the impact. You guys at home, when you're reinstalling these wipers, make sure you use hand tools. Do not over tighten them. They're little bolts that easily break.
Cut.
Okay, now we're going to remove these bolts that hold on the wipers and the felt. Now if you see grease leaking out of these wipers or these felts, replacing these wipers and these felts is not going to fix the problem. That means that you have a seal inside, which is located right here, that is allowing gear oil, 90 weight gear oil, from your differential to migrate out and dilute your knuckles. The knuckles have grease in them. They do not have gear oil. So if you see stuff leaking out here, you need to dig all the way down, just like we're doing in this video, and replace that seal. Also inspect your axle, because it might have a groove in it that is causing that seal to leak. So 10mm socket, we'll take these off, and they come with a metal ring. New ones are supplied in the kit. There's an upper and a lower ring, and the lift goes towards the knuckle. Then there is a felt, which doesn't have a slot in it. And then finally inside here is a rubber wiper, as well as a steel spacer ring. Okay? So now the only thing that's holding this knuckle on is the lower and upper bearings. So we're going to pop these things off, and then we'll remove the whole knuckle. Okay, so now I'm going to pull the steering arm off, which also houses and indexes the lower bearing. It's a 17mm socket. Just like the hub, these have a little tapered spacer, so you want to leave the nuts on there. So loosen the nuts, but leave them. Then you can grab your hammer and bang on that arm until it's loose. And once you get it loose, you can go ahead and remove the remaining nuts, washers, and little tapered cones. Okay, I got the tapers out, and this arm just pops out, and that's what indexes that lower bearing. The bearing is going to stay in place right now. So we'll set that on the side, and we will move to the top. Now, same thing, this top, 2 Okay, take those out. Now, don't get these bolts confused. These are very similar to the caliper bolts. The way you tell them apart is that the upper trunnion bearing bolts do not have a recess in them, whereas the caliper bolts do. So you have a lot of 17 millimeter headed bolts, and they all are very similar, but just slightly different. Okay, so now, take a screwdriver, and you should be able to very gently get that top plate to come off. Sometimes you got to kind of work it around. And then if you get really, really desperate, you can take a long punch, poke it up through the bottom, and tap it up like that. And there's your upper bearing support. And here is the tensioning shim. As a rule of thumb, I always start out when I reassemble by using the shim that it came with. Okay, now this guy can be removed, and it just so happens that the lower bearing decided to come with the knuckle. Okay, so now we can use up some more rags and wipe out all that grease, wipe out all this grease, and then we will go digging for the seal, which is right inside here. I'm going to set this aside, and we'll peel off in order. You guys want to make sure that if you're doing this yourself, you keep the order on this wiper. And so the first one that comes off is the metal ring. It's split, so hopefully you can see that. I just kind of twisted it off of there. Next one is the rubber wiper. And then finally, the felt. All comes new in the kit. And here is the upper trunnion bearing. Okay. So we're gonna give some more really nasty rags to the Cintas guy. Get all this stuff cleaned out into the parts washer, and then we will start to rebuild this. I've got the knuckle almost all the way cleaned out. Still have 3 items I need to remove. I need to remove the lower bearing race, the upper bearing race, and the inner seal. Now, I have found that the easiest way to get that inner seal out is to actually just use a screwdriver on the top and try to just bend it and peel it out, and you can get decent separation. Hopefully you can see that in there. And then grab your channel locks and rip it out. Now, some people might give me some crap for doing that. And my response is, now if you pound on it really hard and you can reach in there and feel a burr, you just need to take some emery cloth and smooth that burr out. I found that that method is better than trying to get some hokey puller inside there and yard it out like that. Now you can see, here's what happens to your knuckle if that seal goes bad. Grease and gear oil from the differential starts to migrate in and fill up your knuckle, and it dilutes. Okay, well, your knuckle or your burr field joint is essentially a CV, and it needs to have grease, not axle lube like 90 weight. All right, so last thing before we are done disassembling on the truck is take a long punch and give you a couple little recesses. You pound out the race, and hopefully, I like to do the bottom one first because then you actually have a little bit more room to get your punch up in here to do the top. Now try and pound it out evenly. There you go. Okay? Now we can go in here and clean these guys up. And we are nearly done with disassembly. The final piece we have to disassemble before we can start washing everything and getting it all cleaned up is the actual joint. So I'm going to use a Sharpie and mark the axle. I don't know that this really matters. I just like to do it anyway. It makes me feel better about the situation. I'm going to mark it in 2 spots with 2 different colors. And hopefully one of those will survive the parts washing. Okay, now here is the method for which you remove this inner axle from the actual joint. I've got a piece of metal tube, you can use PVC, and then I have crammed a bunch of paper in the tube itself to cushion the axle as it falls. I've also have a block of wood. Now, the trick here is that you want your tube to fit as tight around this axle as you can. So slip the tube in there like that. Alright? And then it's a pretty simple deal. You just bang the axle down and that separates it from the joint. And then because we have the paper in the bottom, it will cushion the axle. Okay? Now it is separated out, and then you want to inspect the lock ring that holds it in. Okay, now everything is disassembled. It's time to get it all cleaned up in the parts washer. So the next thing you guys are going to see is everything laid out, all nice, neat, clean, organized, ready to reassemble.